Today we're going to be painting a sunset with watercolour paint, breaking the process down into easy to follow step-by-step sections. To begin with, we'll take a look at the photograph and work out what we're going to do with it. This reference photograph was found on Pixabay, and I will put a link down below in the description so that you can go along to Pixabay and have a look at this free reference photograph. So the reason I chose it was because it's very easy to break down into sections that we can paint on top of each other using the transparent layers of watercolour. So the first part is the sky in the background, and then we have the distant trees. Actually, I'm not entirely sure if that shadow that you see in the background at the other side of the lake is trees or if it's some mountains. I think there's a little bit of both, but it's very dark and we can't really define those. But that's your next section. So we go from the sky to the trees, then we have the lake, and then we have the grasses. So just 4 easy to follow sections. As we're going to be using plenty of water today, you need your paper, your watercolour paper, to be either taped to a board or you need to use a gummed pad. When taping it to the board, press down quite firmly on the board side of the tape, not just as firmly on the paper, so that you don't tear the paper later on when you're removing that masking tape. Then draw a nice straight line with a pencil at the other side of the lake where our horizon is. I've actually changed this to the photograph to make a slightly different composition, making it about 1/3 of the way down the paper. Now to make your sun, you need something round to draw around. I've used an acrylic paint pot, but you could use something like an egg cup or maybe a 2-pence piece, depending on how big you wanted your sun to be. Next, I chose to use some masking fluid to mask out the sun. Do this very carefully and make sure it's completely dry before you put your paint over. Of course, you don't have to use masking fluid. You could just keep this area of paper dry, or you could lift some of the colour out whilst your painting's wet. That's entirely up to you. The first colours we're going to mix are going to be for the sky. I'm going to start with a nice big mix, nice and loose, plenty of water, and this is going to be new gamboge, so a nice golden yellow. In the other 3 colours, I'm going to use a red and an orange and a yellow, or various mixes of those. Just using whatever you've got. You don't have to use exactly the same colours as me. Just make sure that there's some nice bright yellows and oranges and reds in there, and have a bit of a play with it. So your first mix needs to be nice and watery, and your subsequent mixes that you're going to put into it are going to be thicker, and that's the trick to working wet in wet. You always want your second mixes, adding it to that first one, to be thicker, so to have more paint and less water. You need to begin by covering the whole paper with that first colour that you made up, that nice loose wash of a nice bright yellow with plenty of water in it. Make sure that your masking fluid is absolutely dry before you do this. Like I say, you might not be using masking fluid, you might be just going around that circle and leaving it white there. Okay, so the thing with painting wet in wet, which this first part of this project is you need to work quite quickly, because you don't want your paint to be drying before you add your next layers in. And I would advise that you stand up to do this so that you can get your brush right the way across your paper. A nice full brush, a nice wet brush, and as you can see, I'm using a very big flat brush. Just use whatever you've got to hand. Don't go out buying new brushes especially, but I do like working with flat brushes and something nice and big so that you can get plenty down there. Okay, so as you come to add in your other colours, just look at the reference photograph and think about where you want those colours. They're going to be coming out from the sun, lots of reds just underneath the sun there, and a line of yellow going down from the sun that's reflecting in the water. Don't worry about your water being yellow at the moment, and we're going to be putting more colours on top of there. And this is another reason I chose this photograph, because the subsequent colours that we're going to be putting on are all darker than the first ones, and we can work from the lightest colours up to the darkest ones and just go over the top of them, because of course they are transparent, the colours will shine through, and that'll give us this feeling of that sunset with all the light bouncing around, coming through those grasses and coming through those distant hills and trees. Okay, so just have a bit of fun with this. If you're not used to working wet in wet, have a practice, do it a few times, that's absolutely fine. But don't let everything be drying out before you put your next layers on. Try and keep that moist as you're working. At this stage, whilst that's all still very wet, you might want to add some colours straight from your pans. So again, these are thicker than the last layers because you've got no water there, you're not adding any water, so you're not going to make a mess when you put them into the wet colours that are already on your paper. And it's a lovely bright, very bright yellow that there is in the photograph, and you want to try and emulate that. So keep it nice and bright, and just add a few extra colours, really thick, from your pans whilst it is all still wet. If you've used masking fluid here, you need to very carefully remove it using clean fingers. You will see, if you're eagle-eyed, that I have actually torn my paper here, possibly for a couple of reasons. One, I've had my masking fluid for a very long time because I very rarely use it other than in YouTube videos. With my own work, I don't tend to use masking fluid, so I've had this pot around for a lot of years. And also, obviously, this is only a practice paper, it's not a high quality paper, so it could be either of those things or a combination. So just be cautious when using it, be very gentle when removing it, and be very gentle with your eraser as well as you get rid of those pencil lines. Of course, you may have chosen not to use masking fluid. Another tip with masking fluid is don't leave it on for too long. So once your paint is dried, you want to remove it. Don't leave it overnight, and certainly don't leave it for a week. It wants to be, off within a few hours of putting it on once everything's dry. Now, if you look at your photograph, you will see that that sun isn't completely white, and it was way too white just with taking the masking fluid off and having the white paper there. So I have put a little bit of a soft yellow over that with plenty of water. And then I dabbed some of that out as well, so it's just taken that glare of the whiteness off the paper, because although it's a very bright object compared to everything else on the picture, it isn't perfectly white. Now we need to mix up some very dark greys. for those distant trees on the other side of the lake. But you do still want them to be transparent because you want some of those nice reds and oranges to come through them, as if we've got that sunlight shining through them a little bit. So I'm just making some greys out of French ultramarine, the cadmium red and the cadmium yellow that we used earlier in the sky. And you can make whichever greeny greys that you want to. Actually, I went very much on the blue side with the darkest grey, and then a little bit of a greeny one, and then I made quite a red one up for, if you look at that distant hill, it's almost red because of the sun shining on it. So just make those all a very similar consistency. I painted on all three colours, starting with that red one in the background, and just carried on working, and then I lifted a little bit of colour out at the end with a very dry brush. You'll see me do that when I get to the end of this section. If you wanted to at this point, you could allow that red hill in the distance to completely dry, then put the next colour on, and then put the next colour on, drying in between each one if you wanted a little bit more control. So your way of working is entirely dependent on you. You could do it wet in wet like I have, or you could let each layer dry and build it up very gradually. If you want to lift some colour out using a dry brush, make sure that it is a dry brush and that you're not introducing any more water onto your painting. At this stage, you don't want to be dripping water off your brush onto your painting. This is where accidents happen, and this is where we can go quite horribly wrong with watercolour. It's all about adding too much water to your paper when you've got the wet paint already on there. To add those few clouds around the base of the sun, I used the same red that I used in the hill, only I think I added a little bit of extra water to it and maybe a little bit of blue. So a very, very similar colour to the one that we used in the hill, and just gradually pop some clouds across the bottom of the sun there, as they are on the photograph. If you look closely, there's some clouds, although it's very difficult to determine which is just sky, which is just the red of the sky, and which is actual clouds that are shining red because of that sunset. You're going to need a colour for the water. I used the French ultramarine again because I'd used it earlier, and I've added some other blues to that, some cerulean and some green and a turquoisey green, just to get those colours that we can see in the photograph there. But don't worry too much, as long as it's got those nice blues in it and nice and bright again. And you can see that I've still got some of the other colours left. Hopefully you will have too. If not, don't worry, you can make up some more dark greys, because you are going to need a little bit touch of dark grey to pop into that blue. And again, make sure that your dark grey is a thicker consistency than that blue that you're making up for the water. When it comes to painting the water, you really need to be standing up. I would, if possible, if you're in a position to be able to do so, I would work standing up for this. You need to be working from your shoulder and going all the way across your paper with nice big broad sweeps to get that horizontal flat feel of the water. Even if there's little waves and things in it, water is also obviously held by gravity, and it lies flat. You don't have it lying uphill. Okay, so you'll see that I'm using what we call a dry brush technique, and this is brilliant for doing water with. Now, everything underneath there is completely dry. So when you're painting with wet paint on top of dry paint, a good tip is to just pretend you're painting on glass and you're being cautious about not breaking it. Have a really light touch with your hand. Don't be scrubbing at the paper, don't be scrubbing with your brush. Very, very lightly put this paint on. So a dry brush technique is where you use the brush on its side, you load it with paint and you allow it to run out of paint, and then you get these little bits of texture, which could be flecks of light or little ripples in the water. If you've not used this technique before, again, practice this on a piece of rough paper, or indeed do this same painting a few times and practicing it each time if you've got some practice paper that you can do that with. and you've got the time to do it. Practice is the main thing with getting better at watercolour. Using all these different techniques on a daily basis, you're going to get familiar with your own materials and with the paints that you're using, the brushes and the paper that you're using. And I can't stress that enough. When people have problems with watercolour, it's because they're not familiarising themselves enough with their own things that they're using, their own colours, brushes, paints, and the paper as well. They all have a big impact, but the thing that has the most impact is the amount of water that you're using. Unless I'm sat with you doing it with you, I cannot help you with that. That's all trial and error. So you'll see that I'm putting some dark in as well. Again, whilst that water is, sorry, I'm calling it water, it is in the lake. While that paint is still wet, I'm putting some of those darker areas in as well and letting that go into those lighter blues that we've got there. And again, using that dry brush technique. So you may want to practice this. Don't forget to have tissue handy so that you can lift some colour out if you feel you've gone too dark. For the foreground grasses, I've got a slightly smaller brush with a nice point on it, and I'm using that dark grey with some extra ultramarine, some extra painting to make that thicker, and some more of the red and yellow as well, but making it on the blue side. You could make several colours for this, and I did just use up what was in my palette that I'd already got made up. If you wanted to, and you could do this also with the background hills as well, if you wanted to get a lot more contrast in this, you could go darker than I have. But also you could use pens. So when you come to those grasses in the foreground, you might want to draw those in with some drawing pens if you've got some nice pens. And it would be quite good to do with a dip pen. So you don't have to do this in paint if you don't want to. It is quite nice for them to be a little bit transparent, and again let those oranges and peachy colours out of the water shine through them a little bit. I've gone a bit heavy-handed in places. I've also made some of these grasses way too thick in places. So you'll have more time than I have just to perfect this and have a real good look at that photograph and the different shapes that you can see there in the grasses. I've obviously just done this in a bit of a rush to show you the processes. So that's what I wanted to do today, was to show you that you can make this sunset that looks quite complicated at first glance. When you first looked at that photograph, you probably thought what a complicated photograph it was to do. How we've simplified it, we've taken some of those greens away out of the sky that weren't really adding anything to it. We've moved the horizon a little bit. We've brought the sun a little bit further into the painting to make a nicer composition. And we've, like I say, we've simplified the colours, we've simplified the shapes, and we've done it a stage at a time, and you end up with a very pleasing picture. So I'm hoping you've enjoyed that, and I'm hoping you've learned something from it. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. I will be back again soon with another tutorial. In the meantime, if there's anything that you would especially like me to do, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you very much for watching, and bye bye for now.